Imagine waking up in a world where mental illness is treated not with therapy or pills, but with a surgical shortcut. This video is not about the past staying in the past. It is about asking what kind of present we would live in if lobotomy still existed today. And before we go deeper, if you like dark alternative history, uncomfortable questions, and stories that challenge modern morality, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because this is exactly the place where we explore the ideas most people avoid. Lobotomy was once advertised as a miracle cure in the mid-20th century. Doctors claimed it could calm anxiety, cure depression, stop schizophrenia, and turn difficult people into functional members of society. The procedure was fast, cheap, and brutal, a metal instrument pushed into the brain to sever connections in the frontal lobe, the part responsible for personality, decision-making, and emotional depth. Now imagine that this practice was never abandoned. Imagine it evolving. Alongside smartphones, social media, and modern medicine in a modern world, lobotomy would not be called lobotomy. The name would be rebranded, marketed as something clean and scientific, maybe neural regulation surgery or cognitive stabilization procedure. The language would matter, because language always hides violence behind comfort. Ads would show smiling patients, relieved families, and calm doctors promising fast solutions to emotional chaos. The first place modern lobotomy would thrive is in overcrowded mental health systems, long waiting lists for therapy, underfunded hospitals, doctors pressured to deliver results quickly. Instead of years of treatment, a single procedure could promise permanent emotional stability. In this world, consent becomes complicated. When someone is severely depressed, suicidal, or psychotic, can they truly consent? Families might sign papers on their behalf. Governments might define danger to self or others very broadly. A rebellious teenager, a traumatized soldier, a prisoner who refuses to cooperate. All could suddenly qualify for treatment. Now think about social pressure. In a society obsessed with productivity, emotional extremes are inconvenient. Too sad, too angry, too anxious, too creative. If lobotomy existed, it would be sold as balance. Not happiness, just calm. A flat, manageable emotional line. And slowly, the definition of normal would shrink. People who feel too much would be seen as broken. By the end of this block, ask yourself one question. If a painless procedure could erase your deepest pain, but also dull your strongest passions, would you take it? Because in a modern world with lobotomy, that choice would not stay hypothetical for long. The line between healing and control would become dangerously thin. Today, mental health is already medicalized. With lobotomy still around, that process would go even further. Instead of antidepressants, doctors might recommend surgical intervention for chronic sadness. Instead of anger management, a permanent neurological fix. For corporations, this would be revolutionary. Imagine employees who never burn out, never protest, never feel existential dread. Workplace wellness programs could quietly include advanced neurological care. Not mandatory, of course. Just strongly encouraged. Promotion opportunities might mysteriously favor those who have undergone the procedure. In the justice system, lobotomy would be framed as rehabilitation. Prison overcrowding would push governments to look for permanent solutions. A violent offender could be neutralized emotionally rather than imprisoned for life. The public would debate whether this is humane or monstrous. Some would argue it is mercy. Others would call it a modern form of brainwashing. But fear has a way of winning arguments. Ethics would be discussed on talk shows while procedures continue behind hospital doors. The media would play a huge role. Stories would circulate about people who were saved. Former addicts who no longer crave. Formerly aggressive individuals now calm and compliant. What would not go viral are the stories of those who lost their identity. The artist who can no longer feel inspiration. The lover who feels nothing. The person who is alive, but not fully there. In this world, emotional pain becomes a crime against efficiency. Suffering is no longer something to understand, but something to eliminate. The question stops being, why do you feel this way? And becomes, why haven't you fixed it yet? And that shift changes everything. By the end of this part, we realize that modern lobotomy would not just treat illness. It would reshape society's relationship with emotions themselves. Pain would be unacceptable. Intensity would be suspicious. And individuality would quietly fade. Now let's talk about who would be most at risk. History shows that lobotomy was often performed on women, minorities, And those without power. In a modern version, that pattern would repeat, just with better branding. People who challenge authority, whistleblowers, activists, protesters, label them unstable, anxious, obsessive, and suddenly treatment becomes an option. Children would be another terrifying frontier. Parents overwhelmed by behavioral issues might be offered a permanent solution. For a child who doesn't fit into school systems, modern lobotomy could be presented as early intervention. The idea of altering a developing brain would be justified by promises of future success and stability. The long-term consequences would be unknown, but ignored. Technology would make it even scarier. With AI brain scans and predictive algorithms, doctors might claim they can identify problematic neural patterns before symptoms fully appear. Preventive lobotomy. A procedure not to cure, but to prevent future suffering or rebellion. At that point, free will itself becomes negotiable. Society would slowly split into two groups: those who are emotionally regulated, stable, predictable, and those who refuse, becoming seen as dangerous, unstable, and irresponsible. Choosing not to alter your brain could be viewed the same way we view refusing vaccines today, but with far more personal consequences. The irony is that a world without lobotomy is already struggling with control. But with lobotomy, control becomes biological. You don't argue with ideas, you erase the ability to feel them deeply. This is not a dystopia of violence. It is a dystopia of quiet. People still smile, streets still function, but something essential is missing. The chaos that creates art, the pain that creates empathy, the madness that sometimes leads to truth. As we approach the end, ask yourself this: if lobotomy existed today, would it really be optional? Or would society slowly push everyone toward emotional silence in the name of safety and progress? Because the most terrifying future is not one where people scream in pain. It is one where no one screams at all. To understand how deeply modern lobotomy would change the world, we need to look at culture, identity, and what it means to be human in everyday life. In a society where emotional extremes are surgically erased, culture itself would begin to flatten. Music would still exist, but it would lose its edge. Songs about heartbreak, obsession, addiction, and despair would slowly disappear from the charts. Not because they are banned, but because fewer people truly feel those emotions anymore. Art thrives on inner conflict, and lobotomy would quietly starve it. Paintings would become pleasant but empty. Movies would avoid discomfort and lean towards safe, emotionally neutral stories. Horror would struggle to exist without deep fear. Tragedy would feel fake without real sorrow. This world would claim to be healthier, but it would feel strangely hollow. Relationships would change dramatically. Love would become calmer, quieter, and less intense. Jealousy, obsession, passion, and destructive attachment would be labeled unhealthy and treated early. Breakups would be processed clinically. Not painfully. People would still stay together, but often out of convenience rather than emotional fire. Marriages would last longer, but would they feel alive? Friendships would become polite and stable, yet shallow, without emotional depth. Bonding becomes functional rather than soulful. Now consider social media. In a lobotomy-accepted world, platforms would celebrate emotional regulation, content promoting. Extreme feelings would be flagged as harmful. Influencers would proudly share their neurological optimization journeys. Before and after videos would show people going from anxious, angry, or depressed to calm, neutral, and balanced. Likes would reward emotional flatness. Comment sections would become eerily polite. Outrage culture would vanish, not because society became wiser, but because people lost the capacity to feel outrage deeply enough. Politics would transform as well. With fewer emotionally driven citizens, protests would shrink. Elections would be quieter, less passionate, and easier to control. Charismatic leaders would matter less than stable administrators. Radical ideas would struggle to spread because radical emotions no longer resonate. Democracy would still exist on paper, but participation would feel distant and passive. When people stop feeling anger, they stop demanding change. And that is exactly why those in power would support neurological control. Education would also adapt. Schools would identify emotional irregularities early. Children who struggle with attention, anxiety, or defiance would be guided toward neurological correction instead of accommodation. Classrooms would become quieter, more efficient, and less creative. Questions that challenge teachers or systems would decrease. Not because students understand better, but because they care less. The brightest minds in history were often unstable, obsessive, and emotionally intense. In this world, many of them would be treated before they ever changed anything. Even spirituality would shift. Religion, philosophy, and existential questioning rely on discomfort with existence. If people no longer feel deep fear of death or longing for meaning, spiritual exploration fades. Rituals become tradition without transcendence. Belief becomes habit rather than desperation or hope. The question, "Why am I here?" loses urgency when emotional pain is dulled. But the biggest illusion of this world is safety. Supporters of modern lobotomy would argue that society is calmer, less violent, and more stable, and statistically, they might be right. Crime rates would drop. Psychiatric emergencies would decrease. Suicide numbers might fall. But at what cost? A person who cannot feel despair deeply also cannot feel joy deeply. You cannot selectively erase pain without touching love, curiosity, and wonder. The human mind is not a menu where you remove unwanted items. The danger of modern lobotomy is not that it creates monsters, it creates emptiness. And emptiness is harder to notice, harder to fight. By the end of this block, we are left with an unsettling realization. This world looks peaceful from the outside, but inside, something essential is missing. The question is no longer whether lobotomy reduces suffering. The question is whether a life without emotional extremes is still a fully human life. And in the next block, we will explore what happens when resistance begins to grow in a society that has forgotten how to feel. Now, imagine the cracks forming in this seemingly perfect society. The people who refuse lobotomy, or who regain their emotional intensity despite procedures, would stand out like living sparks in a gray landscape. They would be called dangerous, unpredictable, maybe even subversive. These individuals would feel the world more deeply, which makes them both extraordinary and threatening in a system that prizes control. Their laughter, anger, grief, and joy would feel almost alien to those who have undergone the procedure. Schools, workplaces, and public spaces would begin to subtly enforce conformity. Not through overt laws, but through social pressure. People who display too much emotion would be questioned, monitored, or quietly nudged toward treatment. Society would invent euphemisms for these interventions. Wellness check-ins, neural optimization programs, behavioral alignment initiatives, all designed to make compliance seem normal, voluntary, and beneficial in this environment. Rebellion would take on new forms, subtle acts of defiance. A sharp critique, a deeply passionate art piece, a protest born from raw emotion, would be the new radical behavior. The few unregulated minds would become secret carriers of humanity, the keepers of feeling and chaos in a world that systematically erases them. They might form underground communities, meeting in basements, forests, or virtual spaces where emotion is not punished. They would trade stories of raw love, heartbreak, fear, and obsession. They would teach each other how to resist the flattening of humanity, how to remember that suffering and joy are inseparable, and how to reclaim the depth of thought and feeling that modern lobotomy tries to erase. These rebels would face constant danger. Companies, governments, and even neighbors trained to value emotional control would see them as threats. A child expressing too much curiosity or grief could be reported. The line between protection and persecution would blur quickly. Laws would exist, but the real enforcement would come from normalized social control, peer pressure, and institutional authority. Medical professionals, once trusted to heal, would increasingly serve as agents of conformity. The question becomes whether resistance can survive when so many systems are aligned against it. The ethics of rebellion would be complex. If an unaltered mind endangers itself or others with uncontrollable emotions, is intervention justified? Or does the moral failure lie with a society that suppresses emotions rather than helping the individual navigate them? Technology would amplify both control and resistance. Modern lobotomy could integrate with AI diagnostics, neural monitoring implants, and predictive behavioral software. People could be flagged before they even show outward signs of emotional intensity. But the same technology could be hacked, subverted, or repurposed by rebels. They could spread messages of emotional liberation, connect isolated, unaltered minds, and create networks of raw human experience in digital shadows. The arts would become a battleground. Music, painting, literature, and film would either conform to emotional neutrality or carry hidden messages of rebellion. Emotional intensity would be coded into allegories, metaphors, and abstract forms, understood only by those who still feel deeply. The psychological pressure on unaltered individuals would be enormous. They would be constantly aware that society views their emotions as dangerous, undesirable, and in need of correction. Yet the very act of resisting, of refusing to dull themselves, would become a profound act of self-affirmation. That a culture of compliance would clash with a culture of raw humanity in subtle, profound ways. Social scientists might try to study these differences, philosophers might debate them endlessly, but for those living it, the tension would be visceral and unrelenting, and the most frightening question emerges. If emotional resistance survives, will it be enough to preserve art, empathy, love, and the chaos that defines human experience? Or will it be systematically eliminated until society is left emotionally barren? By the end of this block, we start to understand that modern lobotomy is not just a medical procedure or social policy. It is a war over the very essence of human life. A war between control and passion, stability and chaos, emptiness and depth. In the final block, we will explore what a full century under this system might look like, how identity, relationships, and society evolve, and whether the human spirit can ever reclaim itself in a world designed to erase it. Now we arrive at the final layer of this thought experiment. A world where modern lobotomy has been normalized for decades, perhaps even a century. Generations have grown up knowing only regulated emotions, predictable responses, and safety above all else. To the outside observer, this society looks orderly, efficient, and harmonious. Crime rates are low. Mental health crises are statistically rare. Productivity is off the charts. Politicians praise the stability dividend. And yet, beneath the smooth surface, something crucial has vanished. The unpredictable, messy, and vibrant essence of human experience. People go through life without experiencing the extremes that make stories worth telling or memories worth treasuring. History itself begins to feel like a curated narrative rather than lived reality. Wars, revolutions, heartbreaks, epiphanies, events that shaped humanity's imagination and understanding, are remembered intellectually but not emotionally. The collective soul of society flattens. Identity becomes a measured formula. Individuals are categorized by their neurological profiles: stable, compliant, optimized, at risk. Personal growth is no longer a journey but a checklist. People no longer grapple with moral dilemmas born from passion or conflict. They simply follow algorithms designed to keep them emotionally within safe parameters. Yet, within this system, there remain anomalies: the unaltered, the resistant, the descendants of those who defied conformity. They are fewer in number, often secretive, but they carry the legacy of true human feeling. They experience art, love, grief, obsession, and rage in ways that the regulated majority cannot even comprehend. These individuals become storytellers, musicians, and philosophers, not because society celebrates them, but because the very act of living fully outside the imposed calm is a rebellion. Their struggles are dangerous. Emotional outbreaks are penalized, and relationships that display extreme attachment are monitored. Society itself has developed subtle tools of enforcement. AI monitors moods through wearable devices. Workplaces encourage neural enhancement programs under the guise of wellness, and social norms penalize anyone who deviates from the accepted emotional baseline. Even acts of intimacy, spontaneity, or grief are measured and moderated. Families are no longer simply nurturers, they are managers, monitoring children's emotional output from birth. The line between care and control blurs completely. And yet, paradoxically, the human spirit finds ways to survive. The underground networks of feeling grow. Small communities exchange stories, music, art, and memory, passing on emotional wisdom to each other in secret. They remember what it feels like to lose a loved one, to burn with obsession, to rage against injustice, to experience the dizzying highs of passion. They become the custodians of raw humanity, teaching that life's value is inseparable from the risk, pain, and ecstasy of feeling deeply. Imagine a world where the majority exists in a state of emotional neutralization while a few rebels live intensely, both dangerous and magnetic. Society appears smooth and controlled on the surface, but these pockets of intensity remind us that life cannot truly be optimized without sacrifice. Art regains a new purpose, not to entertain, but to encode emotional resistance. Music becomes a secret language. Poetry becomes a map of forbidden feeling. Love becomes a form of rebellion, and heartbreak transforms into a quiet act of defiance. And finally, we confront the ultimate philosophical question. Is a life without emotional extremes truly a life at all? In this modern lobotomy world, happiness is measured, sadness is corrected, and unpredictability is neutralized. Stability reigns, but at the cost of identity, creativity, and the chaotic beauty that defines human experience. The conclusion is terrifyingly simple. A society that seeks to erase pain inevitably erases passion, empathy, and imagination. The very elements that make life vivid, worth remembering, and worth sharing are suppressed. And yet, hope lingers, not in the systems, not in the procedures, but in the human spirit that refuses to be flattened. Even in a world designed to erase feeling, the spark of rebellion, the hunger for raw experience, and the desire to live fully survive in the hearts of a few. Because no matter how much control is imposed, some part of humanity will always resist. And that resistance is the final proof that emotions, chaotic, messy, sometimes destructive, are not just flaws to be fixed. They are the core of what it means to be alive. As we finish this exploration, remember, modern lobotomy might seem like a path to safety, efficiency, and calm. But the human mind is not meant to be optimized like a machine. It is meant to feel, to struggle, to create, and to love with all its chaos intact. The question we are left with is chilling yet simple. In a world that offers comfort at the cost of depth, would you choose to remain regulated, or risk the pain and intensity of being truly, gloriously human?